Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to do a quick overview of some different aspects of Indigenous Australian music. I'll be discussing why and how they play certain types of musics, how it's changed and evolved over time, and how it's impacted the post-colonial Indigenous experience in modern Australian life overall. Just like for any culture, music is a really effective platform for Native Australians to express themselves in a variety of ways. It helps convey many different Indigenous themes and issues. It celebrates their culture and their national identity, and it pushes Indigenous thoughts, agendas, and viewpoints more into the public eye. Of course, not all contemporary Indigenous music is made specifically to resist colonial and non-Indigenous powers, but it is a common theme in a lot of music because it's such a pressing issue and such an integral fact in the everyday lives of Aboriginal musicians. Music is a kind of way to rewrite and reinforce their national identity through art and pop culture. Music is also a powerful way to engage in lyrical activism. It allows people to speak out against the problems of racial, economic, and geopolitical injustices that they face. This is important because white Australian media frequently homogenizes and makes harmful generalizations about Indigenous peoples. And musical activism is a way to bring light to more specific micro-issues that impact specific groups. Many ethnomusicologists compare the political lyrical themes in contemporary Indigenous music of the late 20th century to music inspired by the Black is Beautiful movement in the US during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. The word black had a connotation that implied ugliness, dirtiness, and impurity. It exoticized people of color and made them uncomfortable in their own skin through racial shaming. Both Black Americans and Black Australians were pushed into otherness. Just like the Black is Beautiful movement, Indigenous lyrical themes often celebrate Blackness as powerful, sexy, and sovereign. Dreamtime is an important concept to be familiar with when studying Aboriginal music. It's an anthropological term that encompasses Indigenous Australian cosmology. It represents how they see the world was created and how the life that inhabits the earth came to be the way it is today. This is particularly important because the great majority of Indigenous groups in Australia have no written language, so their culture gets passed down generationally through stories, music, art, ceremonies, and rituals. In a lot of Native groups, significant people are given totems for rituals which may or may not be crafted as instruments. They represent their persona and their path of life, and these totems are really important during ceremonies. It's imperative to keep this tradition alive because the arrival of European colonial settlers have drastically reduced their numbers and their cultural presence. The instrument pictured here is the didgeridoo, or the didge for short. It's undoubtedly the most common, the most distinct, and the most universally recognizable instrument of traditional Australian music. It's actually the instrument that you hear being played in the background of this video too. Representations of the didgeridoo in visual arts date it back to about 1500 years ago. It's a drone-type instrument that makes an elongated, continuous buzzing sound when played. It's usually 4 to 5 feet long, it's tube-shaped, and it's typically made with wood from local eucalyptus trees. It's played similarly to a brass instrument, like a trumpet or tuba, by making a raspberry buzzing sound into the mouthpiece. It originally came from tribes in central and northern Australia, but has spread to many other regions since. It's an essential tool for carrying out ceremonial rituals and celebrations. The didge also isn't just a tool for playing music. It can of course be played musically, but it also functions to maintain rhythm for chants and dances, and can be used to imitate animal sounds for stories. It's usually played around a fire at night and is accompanied by other instruments, a storyteller, and interpretive dancers. Other common instruments that complement the didgeridoo include percussive clapsticks, which are pictured on the left, which are played by hitting them together like claves and are often just two boomerangs that are struck against each other. On the right is the bull roarer, which is a wooden slat on a string that is played by swinging it around in circles around your body, and makes a rhythmical gyrating buzz sound. It's important to note that there are many distinct Indigenous groups in Australia, of course, and how they make and use these instruments varies from region to region. There's also a lot of mixing and integrating of traditional and contemporary styles of play. Traditional instruments are often used in modern music, which commemorates their roots and celebrates their cultural identity. It keeps their traditions alive by expressing them through live performances and recorded music with high production value that gives opportunity for more mass exposure. Instruments that are characteristic of Western music, like keyboards, guitars, and drum sets, are accompanied by indigenous folk instruments. Artists also frequently use a combination of English lyrics and lyrics from native languages, which helps raise consciousness and awareness to both insider native-speaking listeners and a broader outsider English-speaking audience. The arrival of colonialism of white settlers has also brought over some influence from Western genres of music. European hymn traditions from storytelling can be seen in various indigenous rituals. American pop culture has also been extremely influential to Australian music. American-style country and folk music inspired a lot of Australian music in the 1950s and began a trend of bush bands that still exists today. These bush bands were originally folk bands that did street performances, but now they've expanded to jam bands of many different genres of music that play street shows. American folk instruments like guitars, drums, banjos, mandolins, and harmonicas were used by the original bush bands. Other American music trends inspired indigenous artists, such as rock and roll in the 1960s, reggae in the 1980s, and alt-rock and pop in the 90s. The indigenous Australian music scene is alive and well today, and new indigenous artists are constantly coming up. Successful classic Aboriginal bands like Yothu and Warumpi Band have mobilized a lot of push for native Australian sovereignty and have pressed these issues into the public eye. They've also inspired countless new young indigenous musicians to speak up and keep their music and their voices alive.